Premier Doug Ford addressed the media this morning and said he is ready to work with anyone to confront the U.S. tariffs.
Well, that's okay if he does that. That's fine. But the United States is subsidizing Canada.
Premier Doug Ford's toughest talk yet about President Donald Trump and his threatened tariffs from the U.S.
They told you trade wars were easy to win, but nobody mentioned they'd be fought with your car payments. The automotive industry built its North American operations around seamless border integration, assuming trade agreements would remain stable. That assumption just cost Ford $2.5 billion and triggered the most sophisticated economic retaliation campaign in Canadian history. We're not talking about polite diplomatic protests. Canada is wielding electricity shutoffs, Tesla tariffs, and European partnership as weapons of economic warfare. Why are supply chains more vulnerable than expected? How did Canada develop such effective leverage? What does Ford's European pivot mean for American manufacturing dominance? So stick with us and find out how this will affect you and your wallet. The supply chain catastrophe. Meanwhile, on the factory floor, the human cost of tariff warfare became undeniably personal. Workers at Ford's integrated facilities watched as production schedules shifted daily based on component availability and cost calculations. The smooth rhythm of assembly line operations gave way to constant uncertainty about which parts would arrive on time and at what price. Michigan component suppliers felt the squeeze immediately. Companies that had built their business models around just-in-time delivery to Ford facilities suddenly faced unpredictable cost structures. Raw materials that crossed international borders multiple times during processing now carried compounding tariff burdens. Small suppliers with thin profit margins couldn't absorb the additional costs and began implementing layoffs to survive. The automotive industry's interconnected nature meant Ford's supply chain disruptions affected competitors as well. General Motors and Stellantis faced similar challenges, creating industry-wide pressure that changed competitive dynamics across North American automotive manufacturing. Companies that had competed now found themselves dealing with shared supply chain vulnerabilities. Ford's purchasing departments worked frantically to identify domestic suppliers who could replace international sources. The transition proved far more complex than simple supplier substitution. Parts manufactured to precise specifications required extensive testing and validation before integration into production vehicles. Engineering teams that should have been developing next-generation technologies instead focused on crisis management and supply chain restructuring. Quality control processes faced unprecedented challenges as Ford scrambled to maintain standards while sourcing from unfamiliar suppliers. The company's reputation for reliability depended on consistent component quality. Yet the disrupted supply chain introduced variables that hadn't existed in their previous manufacturing processes. Farley's evolution. What happens when corporate optimism collides with economic warfare? Jim Farley's transformation from confident industry leader to crisis manager illustrated the brutal reality facing American automotive executives. His public statements evolved from competitive enthusiasm to stark warnings about industry survival as Ford's tariff exposure became undeniable. Farley initially embraced the competitive challenge, viewing tariffs as an opportunity to showcase Ford's domestic manufacturing strength. The company's significant United States production capacity seemed like a strategic advantage when international competitors faced similar tariff burdens. Early calculations suggested Ford could weather the storm better than rivals, with higher import dependency. That confidence evaporated as the true complexity of tariff impact became clear. Ford's domestic manufacturing advantage meant little when the company still imported critical components and finished vehicles from Mexico and Canada. The Maverick pickup truck, one of Ford's most affordable and popular models, rolled off Mexican assembly lines directly into the tariff crosshairs. Investor communications shifted dramatically as Farley's team grappled with the financial reality. Conference calls that once focused on growth strategies and market expansion pivoted to damage control and cost mitigation. Analysts pressed for specific timelines and solutions, while Ford's leadership acknowledged they were operating in uncharted territory with limited strategic options. Farley's warnings became increasingly dire as Ford's analysis revealed the full scope of potential industry disruption. His statement that 25% tariffs across Mexico and Canada borders would blow a hole in the United States industry that they had never seen represented a complete reversal from his earlier optimistic positioning. Ford's leadership team began making decisions that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Suspending exports to China eliminated access to one of the world's largest automotive markets, although reduced tariff exposure. Raising prices on popular models risked customer defection, nevertheless offered the only path to maintaining profit margins. We went through export data, power grid dependencies, and trade deal footnotes. Now you can see why this isn't just about Ford, it's a breakdown of the whole North American system. If that helped connect the dots, subscribe and drop your thoughts below. The breaking point. Deep within the supply chain, the mathematical precision of modern automotive manufacturing began unraveling under tariff pressure. Ford's Chicago assembly plant became the symbol of an industry reaching its breaking point as production costs exceeded sustainable thresholds and forced impossible decisions about facility operations. The Chicago facility had operated as a cornerstone of Ford's North American manufacturing network, producing popular Explorer and Lincoln Aviator models that generated significant revenue streams. Hundreds of suppliers coordinated deliveries to maintain steady production rates that kept thousands of workers employed and supported surrounding community economies. Tariff calculations transformed routine procurement decisions into complex financial puzzles. Components that previously moved freely between suppliers now carried additional cost burdens that accumulated throughout the assembly process. Ford's procurement teams spent increasing time navigating tariff classifications and seeking alternative sourcing options that maintained quality standards within budget constraints. Production managers faced daily challenges coordinating supplies with unpredictable cost structures and delivery schedules. Parts that should have arrived according to established timelines faced border delays and additional inspection requirements that disrupted carefully orchestrated assembly processes. Ford's financial analysis revealed the stark mathematics of tariff impact on facility operations. The Chicago plant's cost per vehicle increased beyond competitive thresholds, making continued production economically unsustainable. Without significant operational changes or consumer price increases that could reduce demand and employment levels, the decision to halt Chicago production represented more than facility closure. It symbolized the fracturing of integrated manufacturing networks that had defined North American automotive production. Workers who had built careers around stable employment at the facility suddenly faced uncertainty about their economic future and community stability. Community leaders around the Chicago facility began preparing for economic impact, as Ford's decision affected not just direct employees, however, supporting businesses, local tax revenues, and regional economic stability. The announcement sent shockwaves through Ford's remaining facilities, as workers wondered which operations might face similar cost pressures. Subsequently, Ford's pain was just the opening move in a much larger game, and Canada was about to play a hand that nobody saw coming: the electricity weapon. "If you pick a fight with us, we'll fight back." Those words from a senior Canadian official weren't just diplomatic posturing, they were a declaration of economic war. While Ford scrambled to manage its tariff crisis, Ontario Premier Doug Ford prepared to deploy electricity as a weapon, catching Washington completely off guard. Canada supplies massive amounts of electrical power to New York, Minnesota, and Michigan through an integrated grid system. Ontario alone exports enough electricity to power millions of American homes daily. That dependence became a strategic vulnerability when Doug Ford announced a 25% surcharge on all electricity exports to the United States. The mathematics were brutal. American families would see their electricity bills increase by approximately $100 per month. Industrial facilities dependent on Canadian power faced cost increases threatening operational viability. Ford's threat escalated beyond surcharges. He delivered a chilling ultimatum to shut off electricity exports completely if tariffs continued. The ripple effects spread immediately through American energy markets. Utility companies began emergency planning for potential disruptions. Industrial customers calculated the cost of alternative power sources or production shutdowns. The integrated North American energy grid that once represented cooperation suddenly became a weapon weapon in an escalating trade war: surgical strike strategy. Mark Carney understood economic warfare better than most politicians. The former central banker turned deputy prime minister weaponized tariffs with surgical precision designed to maximize political pressure while minimizing damage to Canadian interests. Carney's $30 billion retaliation package targeted specific American products chosen for their political impact. Agricultural goods from Republican-leaning states faced immediate tariff increases. American whiskey, a symbol of Kentucky's economy and Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell's home state, became a primary target. Consumer products from swing states found themselves subject to punitive duties designed to generate voter pressure. The strategy revealed sophisticated understanding of American political dynamics. Rather than broad retaliation that might unite American opinion, Carney selected targets that would divide political coalitions. Regional economic pain would translate into pressure on the Trump administration from within Republican ranks. Canadian trade officials worked around the clock, implementing tariff structures that maximized leverage while maintaining legal compliance with international rules. Every product selection underwent analysis of its political impact and potential for generating American domestic pressure. Carney announced the first wave would expand rapidly if American tariffs continued. $30 billion would become $155 billion within weeks. But even the most calculated economic warfare needs a symbol. And Mark Carney found his in one name that would send shockwaves through Silicon Valley and Washington alike: Tesla. Tesla in the crosshairs. Why Tesla? The question echoed through corporate boardrooms as Canada's most audacious retaliation move took shape. Targeting Elon Musk's electric vehicle empire wasn't just strategic, it was personal, political, and economically devastating. Tesla represented more than another car company in the escalating trade war. As a $1 trillion company, Tesla embodied American technological innovation and entrepreneurial success. Musk's vocal political support made any attack on Tesla a direct challenge to Trump's most prominent business ally. Canadian officials calculated Tesla's vulnerabilities with precision. The company sold over 50,000 vehicles in Canada during 2024, making it a significant market. A 100% tariff would double the price of a $50,000 Model Y overnight, effectively destroying Tesla's Canadian market. The targeting went beyond sales impact. Tesla had been quietly building relationships with Canadian mining companies to secure lithium, nickel, and other critical battery materials. Canadian retaliation threatened to sever those relationships and redirect materials to European or Asian competitors. Tesla's stock price reflected investor concern as the North American growth strategy, dependent on Canadian market expansion and supply chain integration, faced disruption. Yet, while Tesla reeled from the impact, Ottawa had already begun executing its long game, one that quietly rewired the map of global trade and left Washington watching from the sidelines. The European pivot. Ottawa quietly executed a strategic pivot that would fundamentally alter North American economic relationships. The European Union wasn't just Plan B. It was becoming Canada's primary focus for future trade and investment. The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the European Union, signed in 2017, provided the legal framework for strategic realignment. The agreement had already slashed tariffs on 98% of goods, boosting Canadian exports to Europe by 30%. What started as trade diversification was becoming economic lifeline as North American relationships deteriorated. Canadian trade officials accelerated negotiations with European counterparts, seeking expanded access and deeper integration. Steel exports to the European Union had already exceeded 1 million tons since the agreement took effect. The logistics challenges were significant. Shipping from Halifax to Rotterdam took 2 weeks compared to hours between Windsor and Detroit. Nonetheless, the costs became competitive as American tariffs escalated. Canada's critical mineral resources aligned perfectly with Europe's electric vehicle ambitions. Lithium deposits in Quebec's James Bay region could supply European battery manufacturers seeking alternatives to Chinese-controlled supply chains. The European pivot represented more than trade statistics. It symbolized Canada's determination to reduce economic vulnerability to American political volatility. Atlantic economics. Can Canada really replace the most convenient trading partner in the world with an ocean-separated alternative? The question challenged every assumption about North American economic integration, as Canadian officials worked to prove European trade could compensate for American market disruption. The mathematics seemed overwhelming. Shipping a container from Halifax to Rotterdam required 2 weeks and cost thousands times more than trucking goods to New York. The United States shared a 5,500-mile border with Canada, enabling goods to move between Windsor and Detroit in hours rather than days. Replacing that proximity advantage demanded fundamental changes in Canadian business planning and logistics. Transportation costs represented just the beginning of Canada's European challenge. Canadian automotive parts designed for North American assembly required retooling to meet European Union safety standards. German automakers maintained supplier networks that weren't eager for Canadian competition when domestic alternatives existed. Yet Canadian trade statistics suggested the pivot might work. Bilateral trade with the European Union had reached $60 billion by 2024, growing consistently since the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement took effect. European partnerships offered stability and predictable regulatory frameworks that enabled long-term business planning. Brussels calculates. European Union officials watched the North American trade war with growing excitement as opportunities emerged to poach investment, redirect supply chains, and weaken American economic influence. What appeared to be Canada's desperate search for alternatives looked like Europe's strategic windfall from Brussels' perspective. German automotive executives began serious discussions about sourcing Canadian steel and aluminum for European production facilities. BMW representatives explored partnerships with Nova Scotia's suppliers who could provide materials for German manufacturing. The conversations represented more than commercial transactions. They embodied Europe's strategic effort to reduce dependence on American-dominated supply networks. French electric vehicle startups investigated Canadian lithium supplies from Thunder Bay mining operations. European battery manufacturers sought secure supply chains independent of Chinese control and American political interference. Canadian resources offered geographic diversification and political stability that aligned with European strategic autonomy goals. The potential for a North American-European trade bloc, excluding the United States, represented a fundamental shift in global economic relationships. European officials privately discussed scenarios where American isolation under protectionist policies created opportunities for expanded European influence in Western Hemisphere trade relationships. The critical mineral game, hidden beneath Canada's forests and tundra, lay the elements that would power the 21st century economy, and European leaders had finally realized their strategic value. Cobalt, nickel, and rare earth deposits scattered across Canada represented more than mining opportunities. They embodied Canada's path to economic independence and Europe's route to strategic autonomy. Quebec's James Bay region contained lithium reserves that could supply European battery manufacturers seeking alternatives to Chinese-controlled sources. Mining companies that had focused primarily on American markets began redirecting exploration toward European partnerships. The shift symbolized Canada's determination to leverage natural resource wealth for strategic independence. European automotive companies accelerated their Canadian sourcing strategies as trade war pressures mounted. Volkswagen's Chattanooga facility began investigating Canadian aluminum supplies. Tesla's competitors saw opportunities to secure Canadian materials, while Tesla itself faced potential supply chain disruption from Canadian retaliation. Investment flows began shifting as European companies committed capital to Canadian mineral development projects. Norwegian mining expertise combined with Canadian reserves to develop projects specifically designed for European market integration. Canadian officials understood their resource leverage extended beyond immediate trade statistics. Control over critical minerals provided political influence in European decision-making processes. We analyzed production shutdowns, trade retaliation, and power grid blackmail so you didn't have to. Now you know how your electricity bill, your car loan, and your job are suddenly on the front lines. If that's worth knowing, subscribe and tell us how it's affecting your life. The Windsor Revelation. Across the river from Detroit, the Stellantis Windsor assembly plant sat idle for 2 weeks. In April 2025, its silence echoing through the Ontario automotive corridor like a funeral bell. The shutdown exposed the brutal mathematics of integrated North American manufacturing under tariff pressure. James Stewart, president of Unifor Local 444, confirmed the shutdown resulted directly from American tariff policies disrupting supply chains. Parts that should have crossed the border multiple times during assembly processes now faced cost penalties that made production economically unsustainable. The Windsor facility employed 3,800 hourly workers, whose paychecks depended on the smooth flow of components between Canadian and American suppliers. The plant's closure symbolized the breakdown of integrated manufacturing networks that had defined North American automotive production. Canada's automotive sector directly employed 125,000 workers, while supporting nearly 500,000 jobs in related industries. Premier Doug Ford's response was swift. Ontario's Liquor Control Board banned American spirits sales immediately, targeting Kentucky bourbon and Tennessee whiskey with surgical precision. The federal government's $2 billion Strategic Response Fund represented Canada's determination to protect automotive jobs through direct subsidies. The fund acknowledged that market forces alone couldn't preserve Canadian automotive employment under sustained American tariff pressure. Moving forward, the survival of Canada's automotive industry hung in the balance, with the possibility that an entirely new economic relationship might emerge from the chaos of trade warfare. Consumer chaos. Your retirement savings. They just became a bargaining chip in an economic war that nobody voted for. American consumers discovered the brutal mathematics of tariff warfare when Ford raised prices on Mexico-produced vehicles by up to $2,000 effective. May 2nd, becoming the first major automaker to pass tariff costs directly to buyers. The Ford Mustang Mach-E electric SUV, Maverick pickup, and Bronco Sport faced immediate price increases that transformed affordable vehicles into luxury purchases overnight. A $50,000 Model Y Tesla would cost $100,000 under Canadian retaliation tariffs, effectively pricing middle-class families out of electric vehicle adoption, despite government incentives promoting clean energy transition. Yale University's budget laboratory calculated the average American household would lose approximately $1,200 in purchasing power due to automotive tariffs alone. That figure excluded secondary effects from supply chain disruptions, employment impacts, and regional economic displacement as manufacturing facilities adjusted to new cost structures. Consumer behavior shifted rapidly as buyers recognized tariff policies would permanently alter automotive pricing. Dealers reported increased urgency among customers seeking to complete purchases before additional price increases took effect. The psychology of scarcity replaced normal market dynamics as political uncertainty made future pricing unpredictable. American automotive sales could drop by more than 1 million vehicles annually if tariffs remained permanently in place, according to industry analysts. The reduction would affect not just automotive manufacturers, but supporting industries including financing, insurance, maintenance, and aftermarket services that depended on steady vehicle sales volumes. Regional economic impacts varied dramatically based on local industry concentration and political alignment. Michigan communities dependent on automotive employment faced different challenges than agricultural regions targeted by Canadian retaliation. The uneven distribution of tariff impacts created political pressure that complicated national policy coordination. Industry transformation. Meanwhile, across boardrooms in Detroit, the automotive industry's most powerful executives faced a reality none of them had planned for. The integrated North American manufacturing system they had spent decades building was disintegrating in real time, and no amount of lobbying or negotiation could restore the previous equilibrium. General Motors reported expected tariff costs between $4 and $5 billion, dwarfing even Ford's massive exposure and forcing fundamental recalculation of North American production strategies. Stellantis suspended its financial guidance entirely, acknowledging that tariff uncertainty made reliable forecasting impossible. The industry's three largest manufacturers simultaneously admitted they were operating without clear strategic direction. Automotive suppliers faced even more severe pressure than final assembly manufacturers. Small companies that had built business models around just-in-time delivery across North American borders couldn't absorb tariff costs or delays that disrupted carefully orchestrated production schedules. Hundreds of supplier companies began layoff procedures as their automotive customers adjusted procurement strategies. The United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, once celebrated as improved NAFTA, became meaningless as tariff policies overrode trade commitments that had governed North American commerce. Legal frameworks that had enabled integrated manufacturing suddenly provided no protection against political decisions that ignored existing agreements. Manufacturing executives acknowledged privately that supply chain restructuring would require years of investment and planning, even if tariff policies were reversed immediately. Supplier relationships, quality certification processes, and logistical networks couldn't be rebuilt quickly enough to restore previous efficiency levels within current business cycles. Honda and Toyota maintained production levels by absorbing tariff costs rather than disrupting supply chains, but their willingness to subsidize operations had limits. Japanese automakers with strong balance sheets could weather short-term losses better than American competitors, already struggling with electric vehicle transition costs and competitive pressure. Now the question is, what happens when economic theory collides with human lives? How did workers and communities discover they were expendable in the new economic reality? Human cost workers at automotive facilities across Ontario and Michigan learned the answer as theoretical trade policies, translated into pink slips, plant closures, and shattered communities that had built their futures around manufacturing stability. 900 workers at Michigan and Indiana component plants lost jobs overnight when Ford shifted production to avoid tariff exposure. These weren't abstract statistics. They represented families with mortgages, children in school, and retirement plans suddenly worthless. Communities that had prospered during decades of automotive boom faced economic devastation as their primary employers adjusted to new cost realities. Restaurant owners near Ford's Michigan facilities watched customer traffic evaporate as laid-off workers eliminated discretionary spending. Local businesses that had thrived on plant worker paychecks faced their own survival decisions as the economic multiplier effects of plant closures rippled through regional economies. Schools and automotive-dependent communities worried about declining enrollment and reduced tax revenues as families relocated seeking employment opportunities. The social infrastructure built around stable manufacturing. Employment couldn't adjust quickly to economic disruption that destroyed the foundation of regional prosperity. Union representatives found themselves negotiating not for wage increases or benefit improvements, but for basic job preservation and transition assistance. Traditional collective bargaining frameworks seemed inadequate for addressing existential threats to entire industrial sectors, caused by political decisions beyond worker or company control. Retraining programs designed for gradual economic transition couldn't accommodate sudden displacement of thousands of skilled workers whose expertise had become economically obsolete under new trade policies. Technical skills developed over decades of automotive manufacturing weren't easily transferable to other industries available in affected regions. Canadian workers faced additional uncertainty as their government's retaliation strategy prioritized political pressure over immediate economic relief. The strategic logic of targeting American political interests offered little comfort to workers whose livelihoods depended on cross-border trade relationships being destroyed by both governments. But the final revelation would prove that everything had changed permanently, and there was no going back. Point of no return. Trade wars rarely crown winners, just bruised losers struggling with the wreckage of relationships that took decades to build and moments to destroy. Ford's $2.5 billion tariff hit represents more than corporate losses. It symbolizes the permanent fracturing of North American economic integration that had defined continental prosperity since World War II. The numbers tell the story of transformation that cannot be reversed. Canada's $30 billion retaliation expanding to $155 billion in targeted American goods. Tesla facing $100,000 price tags in Canadian markets. Ford facilities closing permanently rather than temporarily. These aren't negotiating positions. They're the mathematics of economic divorce. Mark Carney's Strategic Response Fund and Doug Ford's electricity weapon demonstrate Canada's recognition that survival requires fundamental independence from American economic dominance. The European Union pivot isn't Plan B anymore. It's become the primary strategy for a country that spent centuries building prosperity through continental integration. American consumers paying $1,200 more annually for the privilege of economic nationalism discovered the true cost of political rhetoric translated into policy reality. Middle-class families priced out of vehicle purchases learned that tariff protection comes with tariff taxation that falls heaviest on those least able to afford it. Industry analysts analysts predicting 1 million fewer vehicle sales annually understand they're documenting not temporary disruption, but permanent market contraction. The automotive sector that employed millions across 3 countries is becoming 3 separate industries, competing rather than cooperating. Ford's deal with Canada wasn't just a trade decision, it was a turning point. The collapse of North American integration and the rise of economic fragmentation could reshape the global order for decades. So what do you think? Are we witnessing the end of economic cooperation, or just the painful birth of a new model? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read everyone. And if this helped you see the bigger picture behind the headlines, thank you for watching all the way through.